The stagecoach door opened, and she stepped down into the dust with bruises still dark across her cheekbone. Her hands shook as she smoothed her dress. The man waiting wasn't smiling. Before we dive into the story, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Also, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible stories tomorrow. Now, let's continue with the story. Clara Ashford had never seen Montana Territory before, but Granger Falls felt painfully familiar. The depot sagged under the afternoon sun, weathered and worn, and the handful of people gathered there watched her with the same blend of curiosity and judgment she'd encountered everywhere she'd tried to disappear. She kept her gaze lowered, fingers wrapped tightly around the cracked leather handle of her single bag, focusing on its texture so she wouldn't think about the dull, persistent ache in her ribs, where her father's boot had landed 3 nights before she fled Philadelphia. Silas Drummond waited near his carriage, tall and well-dressed, his fine clothes unable to disguise the chill in his eyes. He assessed her the way her father once judged horses at auction, measuring, calculating, noting imperfections. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze for a heartbeat before looking away again. That brief exchange told her everything. She'd answered his advertisement, believing she was buying escape. A fresh start. Distance from fists she knew too well. But the rigid line of Drummond's jaw, the impatient drumming of his fingers against his leg, the tightening of his mouth as his eyes lingered on the bruises she'd tried to hide with the powder, all of it spoke a language Clara understood fluently. "You're smaller than I expected," Drummond said coolly. "And damaged." The word struck harder than a slap. Clara's grip tightened on her bag, the trembling in her hands crawling up her arms. "I can work, sir," she said quickly. "I'm a good cook. I clean and mend and—" "We'll see." He gestured to his foreman, a sun-leathered man who refused to meet her eyes. "Put her bag in the carriage." Across the street, Sheriff Nate Harlow leaned against the post outside his office, watching the scene with growing tension in his shoulders. He'd seen Drummond collect 2 other mail-order brides over the past 4 years. The first left town suddenly, or so Drummond claimed. The second was buried in the churchyard after what Drummond called a tragic riding accident. Nate had his doubts about both stories, but doubts weren't evidence, and in 1878, a man's treatment of his intended wife wasn't exactly the law's concern. But when Drummond grabbed Clara's arm to lead her toward the carriage, and she flinched so hard she dropped her bag, scattering her few belongings in the dust, Nate saw something that made his jaw clench. That wasn't just nervousness. That was the reaction of someone who'd learned that sudden movements meant pain. Clara scrambled to gather her things, her face burning with shame, as a worn Bible and 2 faded dresses tumbled across the ground. Drummond didn't help. He just stood there, arms crossed, while his foreman eventually moved to assist. When Clara straightened, Nate caught sight of her split lip, barely healed, and the way she held her left side as though breathing hurt. Drummond noticed him watching. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and something passed between them. A challenge, maybe, or a warning. Nate touched the brim of his hat slowly, deliberately. Drummond's expression hardened. Then he turned and climbed into the carriage, leaving Clara to struggle up behind him on her own. As the carriage pulled away, Nate stood there in the fading light, already knowing he'd made a choice. He didn't know yet what it would cost him, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this one disappear. Nate waited 3 days before riding out to the Drummond ranch. Any sooner would have drawn attention, and he needed a reason that couldn't be questioned. A report of cattle rustling 2 counties over gave him the excuse. The ranch sat at the end of a long dirt road, swallowed by miles of empty grassland. Isolation by design. Nate thought. Hard for neighbors to hear anything when there weren't any neighbors. He found Clara alone in the kitchen. She moved cautiously around the cast-iron stove, each breath shallow, as though drawing in more air would hurt too much. Her dress hung loosely on her slight frame, and she favored her right side heavily. When she reached for a pot on a high shelf, she gasped and pressed her hand to her ribs. "Let me get that for you, ma'am," Nate said from the doorway. Clara spun around, eyes wide with fear. The wooden spoon slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Nate watched terror give way to recognition, and then to something dangerously close to relief. "Sheriff," she said hoarsely, "I didn't hear you ride up." "Didn't mean to startle you." He picked up the spoon and handed it back, noting the yellowing bruise on her wrist, the unmistakable imprint of fingers gripping too hard. "Mr. Drummond around?" "He's checking the north pasture. Should be back soon." She turned to the stove quickly, but not before Nate saw the fresh cut above her eyebrow. "I'm making supper. He doesn't like it when supper's late." The way she said it, flat and resigned, made Nate's chest tighten. He'd heard that tone before, in his sister's voice during her last visit home, right before she went back to the husband who eventually killed her. "How'd you hurt your ribs?" he asked quietly. Clara's hand stilled on the pot. "I fell." "Down the stairs?" "Yes." "Funny thing," Nate said, keeping his voice gentle. "This house doesn't have stairs." Her shoulders went rigid. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the bubbling pot and the tick of the kitchen clock. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Please don't make trouble, Sheriff. It'll only make things worse for me." Before Nate could respond, boots thudded on the porch. Clara's whole body tensed like a rabbit sensing a wolf. She grabbed a dishcloth and busied herself at the counter, movements suddenly frantic. Drummond filled the doorway, his expression darkening when he saw Nate. "Sheriff, this is unexpected. Just checking on reports of rustling in the area," Nate said evenly. "Wanted to make sure your stock's accounted for." "Everything's fine here." Drummond moved to the table and sat, his eyes never leaving Nate. "Clara, where's my coffee?" She hurried to pour it, hands shaking enough that the cup rattled against the saucer when she set it down. A few drops splashed onto the table. Drummond stared at the spill. "You're making a mess." "I'm sorry, A man works all day and can't even get coffee served properly." His voice stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. "What exactly am I paying to feed you for?" Clara flinched. Nate's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, though he caught himself before reaching for his gun. This wasn't the kind of threat you could arrest a man for, not in 1878. Just cruelty dressed up as a husband's disappointment. "The coffee looks fine to me," Nate said. "Actually, Mrs. Drummond, I could use a cup myself if you don't mind." The use of the title made Drummond's jaw tighten. "She's not Mrs. Drummond yet. Wedding's in 3 weeks." "My mistake." Nate accepted the cup Clara poured with shaking hands. "Thank you, Mom." Drummond stood abruptly. "I'll walk you out, Sheriff. I'm sure you've got better things to do than drink coffee in my kitchen." It wasn't a suggestion. Nate met Clara's eyes one more time before following Drummond outside. What he saw there was pure desperation, a silent plea she couldn't put into words. As he rode away from the ranch, Nate made himself a promise. He'd find a way to help her, badge or no badge, because if he didn't, he already knew how this story would end. He'd lived through that ending once before. Nate found reasons to ride past the Drummond ranch twice more that week. On the third visit, he caught Nate found reasons to ride past the Drummond ranch twice more that week. On the third visit, he caught Clara at the well, struggling with the rope, trying to haul up a bucket one-handed. Her left arm hung limp at her side. He dismounted without speaking and took the rope from her hands. Clara stepped back immediately, her eyes flicking toward the house as though she expected Drummond to appear at any second. "He's in town," Nate said, drawing the bucket up. "Saw him at the land office an hour ago. The tight line of her shoulders eased just a fraction. "You shouldn't be here." "Probably not," Nate replied, setting the bucket on the well's edge. "But here I am." She stared at the water, then at him, and something finally broke. Her face crumpled as she pressed her good hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. Nate stood helplessly as she cried in silence, tears carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "I thought it would be different," she whispered at last. "I thought anywhere was better than Philadelphia, better than my father." "Your father did this." Nate gestured to her arm. She nodded. "He was a dock worker. Strong hands. He used them on my mother for 15 years until they killed her. Then there was just me." Her voice went flat. "I saw Silas's advertisement. Widower seeking wife for Montana territory. It sounded like escape. Like maybe I could stop wondering which bones would break next." "And Drummond?" "Different man. Same fists." A bitter laugh escaped her. "The first night here, I burned the roast. He grabbed my arm so hard I heard something crack, said I needed to learn my place before the wedding, said he paid good money and expected value." Nate's hands curled into fists. "That's not legal. Contract fraud at the very least. Assault." "Is it?" Clara met his eyes, hers far too old for her face. "Because from where I stand, Sheriff, men can do whatever they want to women they claim. My father did it for 20 years. Nobody stopped him. Silas has already told me what happens if I try to leave." "What did he say?" "That the last girl who ran made it 3 miles before his men found her. They brought back her belongings, but she kept going," he said. "All the way to California." Clara's voice dropped. "Except the housekeeper told me different before she quit. Said that girl is buried on the North Ridge, and I better learn to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to avoid the same hole." The words hung in the air like a noose. Nate felt rage and helplessness warring in his chest. "There's another way." "Is there?" Clara picked up the bucket with her good arm. "Because I don't see it." "Marriage contracts can be broken, especially ones procured through fraud or involving abuse. I can get you legal help. There's a judge in Helena who—" "Helena is 200 miles away." Clara started toward the house, water sloshing over the bucket's rim. "And Silas owns half the county. Who do you think they'll believe? A wealthy rancher or a dock worker's daughter covered in bruises she probably deserved?" Nate caught up to her, taking the bucket before she could protest. "I believe you." She stopped walking. When she looked at him, there was something fragile and desperate in her expression, like hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, but wanted anyway. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Nate thought about his sister, about the funeral he'd attended 5 years ago, about all the times he'd suspected something was wrong, but told himself it wasn't his business, about how he'd let her go back, again and again, until one day she didn't come back at all. "Because I didn't help someone once when I should have," he said quietly. "And I'm not making that mistake again." Clara studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded once, quick and decisive. "If you're serious about helping, then help me disappear, because staying here is going to kill me, Sheriff. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually." "I'm serious," Nate said, "and you're not going to disappear. You're going to walk away from this free and legal, with your head high. Before or after Silas kills us both. He won't get the chance." Clara almost smiled. "You don't know him like I do." "Then teach me," Nate said. "Tell me everything, and we'll figure this out together." For the first time since arriving in Montana, Clara felt something besides fear. She felt the dangerous stirring of hope. The law books arrived from Helena 2 weeks later, wrapped in plain brown paper and dropped on Nate's desk. He spent 3 nights reading by lamplight, marking pages with thin strips of leather, building a case that existed only in ink, but needed to be flawless. Territorial law was clear enough. A marriage contract obtained through misrepresentation could be voided. Evidence of abuse prior to marriage was legal grounds for refusal. But Clara needed proof. Documentation. Witnesses. Something strong enough to stand before a judge who knew Drummond's name and bank balance far better than hers. Nate couldn't ride to the ranch anymore. Drummond made that clear the 4th time, standing in his yard with a rifle cradled casually in his arms, asking politely whether the sheriff had business or was just lonely for conversation. So Nate adapted. He left folded notes tucked into the woodpile behind the house, wedged between logs Clara would need for the stove. She'd find them when Drummond was gone, read them quickly, then burn them before anyone could see. The first note was simple. Count the days until the wedding. We need 2 weeks minimum. Her reply came 3 days later, tucked under a rock by the well where Nate rode past at dawn. 18 days. He's getting impatient. The second exchange was riskier. Did he hurt you before you signed the contract? The advertisement lied. He said widow-seeking companion. I expected old, kind. Got neither. Nate's hands shook when he read that. Fraud. Clear and provable if he could get the original advertisement. But Clara's next note stopped him cold. Found something in the cellar. A dress. Not mine. Has blood on the collar. He wrote back immediately. Don't touch it. Don't let him know you saw it. How many other brides before you? Her answer made his blood run cold. Housekeeper said 3. First one got away, she thinks. Second one had the riding accident. Third one just vanished last spring. Nobody talks about her. Nate started asking questions in town, careful and quiet. The general store owner remembered the third girl. Sweet young thing from Ohio, couldn't have been more than 19. Showed up with a black eye already forming, stayed 2 months, then one day Drummond came in alone saying she'd run off with a traveling salesman. Didn't believe it myself, the owner said. That girl was terrified of her own shadow. Can't imagine her running off with anybody. The pieces were falling into place, but so was the timeline. 16 days until the wedding. 14, 12. Then Clara's handwriting changed. The note was shaky, harder to read. He knows something. Watching me different. Checked the woodpile twice yesterday. Nate's reply was urgent. Be careful. Destroy this immediately. Don't write back unless emergency. 3 days of silence. Nate rode past the ranch twice but saw no sign of Clara. Drummond's men were everywhere, watching the road. On the 4th day, a note appeared. Not in their usual spot, but nailed to a fence post where Nate couldn't miss it during his morning rounds. The handwriting wasn't Clara's. Mind your business, Sheriff. The girl is mine, bought and paid for. Next time I catch you sniffing around my property, we'll have a different kind of conversation. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. That evening, Nate was locking up the office when Drummond's foreman appeared, hat in his hands, looking nervous. Sheriff, I got something to tell you and it ain't gonna sit right. Nate's heart dropped. What happened? Mr. Drummond found one of your notes this morning, the one about the advertisement being fraud. The foreman's voice dropped. He beat her bad, Sheriff. Real bad. Then he locked her in the cellar and said she's staying there until she learns her place. Wedding's in 10 days, and he means to have her compliant by then, whatever it takes. Where is he now? At the ranch. Got 6 men with him, all armed. Says if you come near, he'll claim you're trespassing and shoot you legal. Nate grabbed his gun belt. He can try. Sheriff? The foreman caught his arm. He's hoping you'll come. Got it all set up like a trap. You ride out there, you won't ride back. And that girl in the cellar? She'll disappear just like the others. Nate stood in the doorway, rage and helplessness crushing his chest. Clara was locked in a cellar with a monster, and Drummond was daring him to try something stupid. The smart play was to wait, to get a federal marshal involved, to do this legal and safe. But Clara didn't have time for smart. She had 10 days before she became Drummond's wife, and after that, the law wouldn't help her at all. Nate rode out at first light with 2 deputies, both young and pale with nerves. He'd warned them what to expect, watched their expressions tighten when he mentioned Drummond's hired guns. They came anyway. They saw the ranch hands before reaching the house. 6 men scattered across the yard, rifles held loose but ready. Drummond stood on the porch, cigar clenched between his teeth, surveying them like a monarch guarding his domain. "That's close enough, Sheriff," he called when they were still 50 yards out. Nate reined in his horse. "I'm here on official business. Reports of unlawful imprisonment." "Of who?" Drummond's smile never reached his eyes. "My fiancée is resting. Doctor's orders. Poor. Things been unwell. I'd like to see her. And I'd like you off my land." Drummond descended the steps slowly. "You got a warrant, Sheriff? Or you just paying social calls? I don't need a warrant to investigate a crime." "What crime?" Drummond spread his hands. "Clara's here of her own free will. Signed a contract, same as me. If she's changed her mind, that's breach on her part. I'm owed compensation." One deputy shifted in his saddle. Nate raised a hand to stop him. "Let me talk to her," Nate said evenly. "If she tells me she's here willingly, I'll leave." "No." Drummond's voice went flat. "She's my property until the wedding. After that, she's my wife. Either way, she's none of your concern." "A woman isn't property." "Tell that to the law." Drummond pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I got a legal contract here that says otherwise. Paid her passage, paid for her room and board, paid the minister for the wedding. That's money invested, and I'm entitled to protect my investment." Behind him, one of the hired guns levered around into his rifle. The sound was loud in the morning stillness. Nate's deputies reached for their weapons. The ranch hands did the same. Suddenly 8 guns were pointed at 3 men, and the math wasn't in anyone's favor. "Stand down," Nate ordered his men quietly. To Drummond he said, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Drummond smiled. "You come back here without a federal warrant, I'll claim self-defense when my men put you in the ground. And in case you're thinking about getting creative, I've got friends in Helena. Judges, marshals, people who understand how things work out here. A woman signs a contract, she honors it. That's civilized society, Sheriff. I know you fancy yourself some kind of hero, but you're just a small-town lawman in over his head." Nate sat there, every instinct screaming at him to draw his gun and end this. But Drummond was right about one thing. Start shooting now, and Clara would die in the crossfire, if she wasn't dead already. "I want to hear from her," Nate said. "Just her voice. Proof she's alive." Drummond considered this, then nodded to one of his men. "Bring her up." They waited in tense silence. Minutes crawled by. Finally, the door opened, and Clara appeared, supported by 2 of Drummond's hands. Nate's breath caught in his throat. Her face was a mask of bruises, one eye swollen shut. She moved like every step caused agony, and when she tried to stand on her own, her legs buckled. The men held her upright by her arms. "Tell the sheriff you're fine," Drummond said. Clara's good eye found Nate's. What he saw there nearly broke him. Not just pain, but apology. Like she was sorry for dragging him into this. "I'm fine," she whispered. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. "See?" Drummond gestured to his men. "Take her back down." As they turned Clara toward the house, she stumbled. The movement made her cry, "Out!" a sound of such pure anguish that one of Nate's deputies cursed and reached for his gun. "Don't," Nate ordered. Drummond laughed. "Smart man. Now get off my land before my patience runs out." Nate backed his horse up slowly, never taking his eyes off Drummond. His deputies followed, furious and helpless. When they were out of rifle range, the younger deputy exploded. "We can't just leave her there." "We're not," Nate said. His mind was already racing, working through options, discarding the ones that got people killed. But charging in gets her murdered and us with her. So what do we do? Nate thought about the law books in his office, about territorial statutes and marriage contracts and fraud, about how long it would take to get a federal marshal involved and how many days Clara had left. Then he thought about something else entirely, something desperate and probably stupid, but it might be the only card he had left to play. "We're going to call his bluff," Nate said. "How?" "By giving him exactly what he wants." Nate spent 2 days gathering witnesses. The general store owner who'd sold supplies to 3 different brides, the previous housekeeper who'd quit rather than watch another girl disappear, a doctor who'd treated suspicious injuries and kept quiet because nobody asked questions, the minister who'd married Drummond twice before, both times to terrified young women. Then Nate rode into town and nailed a notice to the courthouse door. By noon, half of Granger Falls had gathered in the street. By evening, Drummond arrived with his men, fury radiating off him like heat. "What the hell is this?" He waved the notice at Nate. "Formal charges," Nate said calmly. "Fraud in procurement of marriage contracts. Assault. Suspicion of murder in the disappearance of Emily Brennan. Spring 1877. The crowd murmured. Drummond's face went dark red. "You've lost your mind, Sheriff. You can't prove any of this." "I've got witnesses ready to testify. I've got the original advertisement you placed, which misrepresented your age, temperament, and intentions. I've got medical testimony about injuries consistent with repeated abuse." Nate stepped closer. "And I've got a judge in Helena very interested in what happened to those other girls." Drummond's hand moved toward his gun. 3 deputies materialized from the crowd, rifles leveled. "Go ahead," Nate said quietly. "Make it easy." For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Drummond's hand fell away from his weapon. "This is about the girl," he said. "You want her? Fine, but it'll cost you. She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Sheriff." Drummond's eyes glittered with malice. "I'll drop the contract and leave Montana. Hell, I'll even forget about my investment, but only if you take legal responsibility for her." "What does that mean?" "Marriage." Drummond smiled like a snake. "You marry her, right here, right now, in front of all these good people. You take on all the legal obligations I'm releasing, and I walk away clean." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Nate's deputies looked at each other uncertainly. "You're insane," one of them said. "Am I?" Drummond addressed the crowd now. "The sheriff's been sniffing around my property for weeks, interfering in a legal contract between me and my intended. Now he wants to drag me through court on made-up charges. Seems to me he wants the girl for himself." "This isn't about that," Nate said. "Then prove it. Marry her and take her off my hands, or drop these ridiculous charges and let me finish what I started." Drummond crossed his arms. "Your choice, Sheriff. Be her hero or admit you're just causing trouble because you're lonely." Nate looked at the faces in the crowd. Some sympathetic, some skeptical, all watching to see what he'd do. This was the trap Drummond had set, and Nate had walked right into it. If he refused, Drummond would take Clara back to that ranch and the charges would never stick. A man's word against a rich landowner's money, and everyone knew how that ended. If he agreed, he'd be bound to a woman he barely knew, and Drummond would twist it into proof that Nate had ulterior motives all along. Either way, Drummond won, unless Nate changed the game entirely. "Bring Clara out," Nate said. "Let her decide." Drummond's smile faltered. "She's my property until you just offered to release the contract. That means she's free to choose." Nate raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Bring her here. Let her tell us what she wants. If she says she wants to finish marrying you, I'll drop the charges and walk away. If she wants to leave, you let her go without a fight. And if she leaves, then I'll marry her, take legal responsibility, and you ride out of Montana by sundown." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for the drama. Drummond stood there calculating, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded to one of his men. "Get her." They waited in terrible silence. When Clara finally appeared, supported by 2 of Drummond's hands, the crowd gasped. Her face was worse than before, new bruises layering over old ones. She could barely walk. Nate felt something break inside his chest. They brought her to the middle of the street, released her arms, and stepped back. Clara swayed, fighting to stay upright. Her good eye found Nate's face, and he saw the question there. "Clara," Nate said gently, "you have a choice. You can finish marrying Drummond, or you can walk away. If you walk away, I'll marry you today to protect you legally. It'll be a marriage in name only, just paperwork to keep you safe. You'll have your own room, your own life, and when you're ready to leave, you can. No obligations except what the law requires to keep Drummond from coming after you." Tears tracked through the dust on her face. "And if I choose Silas?" she whispered. "Then I'll respect that choice." Clara looked at Drummond, at the man who'd beaten her and locked her in a cellar. Then she looked at Nate, at the sheriff who'd risked everything trying to save her. Her answer came out clear, despite the split lip, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I choose you." The minister performed the ceremony right there in the street. Clara could barely stand, so Nate held her upright with one arm while he spoke his vows with the other hand raised. His voice was steady, but Clara felt the tension in his muscles, the way his jaw clenched when she swayed against him. "Do you, Nathan Harlow, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "And do you, Clara Ashford, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara's voice came out hoarse. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by Montana territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." No kiss, no celebration, just a piece of paper signed with shaking hands while half the town watched and Drummond stood there with murder in his eyes. "You've made an enemy today, Sheriff," Drummond said quietly. "Get out of Montana," Nate replied. "Today." Drummond mounted his horse, his men following suit. Before he rode off, he looked at Clara one last time. "You'll regret this, girl. Both of you will." Then he was gone, dust rising behind his horse like smoke. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispering. Nate's deputies helped Clara into a wagon. Every movement sent pain lancing through her broken ribs, but she bit her lip and stayed silent. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only made things worse. Nate's house sat behind the jail, a modest structure with whitewashed walls and a small porch. He carried her inside because walking hurt too much, set her down gently in a chair by the unlit fireplace. "I'll get the doctor," he said. "No." Clara caught his arm. "Please. I just need rest." "Your ribs are broken. Maybe your fingers, too." "I know what broken feels like." She pulled her hand back, cradling it against her chest. "I'll heal. I always do." Nate studied her face, and Clara wondered what he saw. Not the girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach 3 weeks ago, that was certain. That girl had disappeared somewhere in Drummond's cellar. "The bedroom's through there," Nate said finally, gesturing to a door. "It's yours. I'll sleep out here. This is your house. And you're my wife." He said it matter-of-fact, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "The bedroom's yours, Clara. I'm not going to argue about it." She wanted to protest, but exhaustion dragged at her bones. She let him help her to the room, watched him light a lamp on the small table beside the bed. The room was plain but clean, with curtains on the window and a quilt folded at the foot of the mattress. "There's a lock on the inside of the door," Nate said. "Use it if it makes you feel safer." Clara stared at him. In her entire life, no man had ever offered her a locked door from the inside. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Nate was quiet for a moment. "I had a sister once, Rebecca. She married young, and her husband wasn't kind. I saw the cast her. Bruises heard her make excuse, watched her get quieter and smaller every time she visited. I told myself it wasn't my business, that married folks had their own way of working things out." He paused, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "One winter, she stopped visiting. Her husband said she was sick, then that she'd died from fever. They buried her before I could get there. It was only later I heard from a neighbor that Rebecca had tried to leave, and her husband made sure she never got the chance." Clara's throat tightened. "I couldn't save my sister," Nate said. "But I could save you, so that's what I did. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Lock this behind me. And Clara, you're safe here. I give you my word on that." The door closed. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, listening to his footsteps retreat across the wooden floor. She heard him moving around in the main room, dragging something heavy. Building a bed out of whatever he could find, she realized. Slowly, she stood and crossed to the door. Her hand hovered over the lock for a long moment. Then she turned it, hearing the bolt slide home with a soft click. For the first time in 20 years, Clara lay down in a bed knowing that no one would come through that door unless she allowed it. No footsteps to fear, no violence waiting in the dark. She cried herself to sleep, but they were different tears than before. These ones tasted like relief. The first week, Clara barely left the bedroom. Nate brought her meals on a tray, knocked softly, and left the food outside the door. She'd wait until his footsteps faded before opening it, taking the plate, and locking herself back inside. On the 8th day, she emerged while he was at work. She moved through the house slowly, cataloguing everything. The kitchen was tidy but clearly belonged to someone who cooked out of necessity rather than skill. The main room held a desk covered in paperwork, a worn chair by the fireplace, and the makeshift bed Nate had constructed from blankets and a thin mattress. Clara found herself standing there, staring at where he slept. The guilt twisted in her stomach. He'd given up everything for a stranger. That evening when Nate came home, Clara was at the stove. She'd found flour and salt, managed to bake bread despite her injured hand. The smell filled the small house. Nate stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." Clara kept her eyes on the bread. "You've done so much, and I've given you nothing but trouble." "You're not trouble, Clara." She finally looked at him. "I'm your wife on paper. That's all. You shouldn't be sleeping on the floor in your own home." "I'm fine where I am. It's not right." Nate crossed to the table, sat down heavily. "What's not right is you feeling like you owe me something. You don't. This arrangement works because neither of us expects anything from the other." But that was becoming less true every day. Over the following weeks, they developed a rhythm. Nate worked long hours, giving Clara space to heal and find her footing. She cooked, cleaned, mended his shirts even though her fingers still ached. Not because she had to, but because doing nothing made her feel useless. One evening, Nate brought home a stack of books. "Thought you might like these," Clara touched the worn covers reverently. I can read a little. My mother taught me before she died. Then you can teach yourself more. He set them on the table. There's no rush. They're yours to keep. She started with a book of poetry, reading by lamplight after Nate went to sleep. The words opened something inside her she'd thought her father had beaten to death. Hope. Possibility. The idea that life could be more than just surviving until the next blow fell. Nate noticed the changes. Clara smiled more, spoke without flinching. She'd started leaving the bedroom door unlocked. Small things, but they mattered. One night, she found him at his desk, squinting at paperwork in the dim light. "You'll ruin your eyes," she said. He looked up, surprised. "Didn't hear you come in. What are you working on?" "Reports. Nothing interesting." He rubbed his face tiredly. Clara hesitated, then asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Why did you really help me? Don't tell me about your sister again. There's something else." Nate was quiet for a long moment. "You want the truth?" "Yes." "I was tired of watching people get hurt while I stood by and did nothing. Being sheriff means enforcing the law, but sometimes the law protects the wrong people. Your father had the law on his side. Drummond had it too, and I was sick of being the man who had to tell someone there was nothing I could do." He met her eyes. "Helping you meant I could finally do something that mattered. Even if it cost you everything." "What did it cost me? A marriage that isn't real to a woman who'll leave the minute she can stand on her own." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "That's not much of a sacrifice." Clara felt something shift in her chest. "What if I don't want to leave?" The words hung in the air. Nate stared at her. "Clara, I'm not saying forever. I'm just saying maybe I could stay a while longer. Not as someone you're stuck with, but as someone who wants to be here." "Why would you want that?" "Because for the first time in my life I feel safe. Because you gave me something nobody else ever has." She took a breath. "You gave me a choice. And I'm choosing to stay." Nate looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as a victim he had rescued, but as a person making her own decision. "Then stay," he said quietly. "As long as you want." That night, Clara left her bedroom door open. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. 3 months after the wedding, Clara was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard the voice that still haunted her nightmares. "Well, well, look at you playing housewife." She dropped the wet sheet, spinning around. Her father stood at the edge of the yard, bigger than she remembered, meaner. The years hadn't softened him. If anything, the lines carved into his face made him look more dangerous. "Papa." The word came out strangled. "That's all you got to say? After you ran off without a word?" He moved closer, and Clara's body remembered every beating, every cruel word. Her feet wanted to run, but she forced herself to stay planted. "Cost me money tracking you down. You're coming back to Philadelphia where you belong. I'm married now. I don't have to go anywhere with you." He laughed, harsh and ugly. "Married? To who? Some frontier sheriff? That's not a real marriage, girl. You're still mine until I say different." Nate's voice cut through the tension. "That's not how the law works." Clara's father turned, sizing up Nate as he approached from the jail. "You must be the fool who took damaged goods off Drummond's hands." "I'm the man who married her legally." Nate stopped beside Clara, close enough that she could feel his presence steadying her. "Which means she's beyond your reach. She's my daughter. She's my wife. The law recognizes my claim, not yours." Her father's face darkened. You think a piece of paper changes anything? I raised her, fed her, kept a roof over her head for 20 years. She owes me." "She owes you nothing," Nate said flatly. "That's not for you to decide." He looked at Clara, and his voice turned cruel. "Tell him, girl. Tell him how you're nothing but a coward who ran instead of taking care of her old man. Your mother's dead because of you, and you think you can just forget that?" The words hit Clara like fists, old wounds opening, old guilt flooding back. Her mother had died taking a beating meant for Clara. She'd lived with that knowledge every day since. But something was different now. Clara had spent 3 months learning what it felt like to be safe, to make choices, to have someone believe her when she spoke. She stepped forward, putting herself between Nate and her father. "Mama died because you killed her," Clara said. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. "You beat her for 15 years until her body couldn't take it anymore. That's on you, not me. And I'm not that scared girl anymore." Her father's eyes narrowed. "You think this man's going to protect you forever? He'll get tired of you, just like everyone else. Then where will you be?" "Right here," Clara said, "because this is my home now, and you're not welcome in it." He moved fast, reaching for her. But Clara was faster. She sidestepped, and Nate was there, catching her father's wrist mid-grab. "Touch her and I'll break your arm," Nate said quietly. Her father tried to pull free. When he couldn't, he reached for the knife at his belt with his other hand. The blade flashed in the sunlight. Nate twisted, using her father's own momentum against him. The knife clattered to the ground. Before her father could recover, Nate had him face down in the dirt with his arm locked behind his back. "You're done here," Nate said. "Clara, get my deputies." She ran, her heart pounding. By the time she returned with help, her father was ranting about rights and property and ungrateful daughters. The deputies hauled him to the jail, still struggling. Nate stayed behind with Clara, who stood in the yard shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "You all right?" he asked. Clara looked at the knife lying in the dirt, at the disturbed earth where her father had fallen, at her own hands that had pushed back instead of cowering. "I stood up to him," she said wonderingly. "I actually stood up to him." "You did more than that. You were brave." "I was terrified." "Bravery isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway." Nate picked up the knife, examining it. "He'll be on the eastbound stage tomorrow with a warning never to come back. If he does, he'll face charges for assault and attempted kidnapping." "Will that stop him?" "It'll have to." Nate met her eyes. "But if he's stupid enough to try again, we'll handle it, together." Together. The word settled into Clara's chest like a promise. Her father had tried to drag her back into the darkness, but she'd found her light, and she wasn't letting go. The morning after her father left on the stage, Clara woke to find Nate already gone. A note on the kitchen table said he'd be back by noon. She made coffee, swept the floors, and tried to ignore the restlessness building in her chest. Something had shifted between them after yesterday. The walls they'd carefully maintained were crumbling, and Clara wasn't sure what lay on the other side. She found the annulment papers while looking for writing paper in Nate's desk. They were dated from months ago, complete and ready to file. All they needed were signatures. Clara picked them up, reading the legal language that would dissolve their marriage, as if it had never existed. Her hands trembled. This was what they'd agreed to. A temporary arrangement, protection until she could stand on her own. She could stand now. Her ribs had healed. Her father was gone. She had choices. The fire crackled in the hearth. Clara stared at the papers, then at the flames. She made her decision. When Nate came home that afternoon, he found Clara in the kitchen making supper. Something in her expression made him stop. "What's wrong?" Nothing's wrong. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. I found the annulment papers. Nate's face went carefully blank. I should have told you about those. They've been ready for weeks. Whenever you want to file them, just say the word. I don't want to file them. The silence stretched between them. Nate stood frozen, like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Clara, I burned them. She gestured to the fireplace. About an hour ago. Why would you do that? Because this marriage stopped being just paperwork a long time ago, and we both know it. Clara took a breath, steadying herself. I'm not asking for promises you can't keep. I'm just saying that what we have here, this life we've built, it's real to me. You're real to me. Nate moved closer, his eyes searching her face. When we got married, I told you it was protection. Nothing more. I know what you said. And now? Now I'm asking if maybe it could be something more. Her voice dropped. If you want it to be. Nate reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness. I stopped seeing this as a convenience the day you left your bedroom door open. Maybe even before that. Then why didn't you say something? Because you deserved time to heal, to figure out who you are without someone telling you what to want. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. I didn't want you staying because you felt grateful or obligated. I wanted you to choose this. Choose me. I am choosing you, Clara said. Not because you saved me, but because you showed me what it means to be respected, to be safe, to be seen as a person instead of property. She placed her hand over his. You gave me freedom, Nate, and I'm using that freedom to stay. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Nate pulled her close, and Clara felt his heart beating against hers. Then we do this right. No paperwork marriage, no legal protection arrangement. What are you saying? I'm saying marry me again. For real this time. Because I love you, Clara Harlow, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that not all men are like your father or Drummond. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Yes. They married again 2 weeks later in the same church, but everything was different. Clara wore a dress borrowed from the general store owner's wife, white and simple. Nate wore his best suit. Their friends filled the pews, people who'd watched them grow from strangers into something deeper. When the minister asked if they took each other, their answers rang clear and certain. This time, when he pronounced them husband and wife, Nate kissed her, gentle and reverent, a promise of all the gentleness to come. That evening, in the house that had become their home, Clara sat beside Nate on the porch watching the sun set over Montana territory. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing. No regrets? He asked. Clara thought about the girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach covered in bruises, terrified and alone. She thought about everything that had happened since, the pain and healing, the fear and courage. Not a single one, she said. Nate squeezed her hand. Good, because you're stuck with me now. I can live with that. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, two wounded souls who'd found healing in the last place either expected. Love hadn't fixed everything. Clara still had nightmares sometimes, and Nate still carried guilt about his sister. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Clara had escaped one prison only to walk into another, but she'd found her way out through the one thing she'd never expected. A man who gave her choice instead of chains, who offered protection without possession, who showed her that love wasn't about ownership, but about freedom. And she'd chosen to stay. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That choice, made freely, meant everything. If this story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we have another incredible tale of courage and unexpected redemption waiting for you.